So thanks a lot, Thomas, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Really honored to speak on a Tech Talk Thursday about Winemaker.com and what we've done on our technical platform. But before we start, we actually have a world premiere. So for the first time ever, we're actually showing our new logo in public. Fortunately, it's so far only live stream. By tomorrow, we should also have updated the website, etc. But in the back, if that doesn't match what you see on the website right now, that's by intention, and I didn't really want to go back and change it to the old logo. So I'll talk here, and I think we have around roughly half an hour, and obviously I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards about our headless cloud-native e-commerce platform. Before we start, quickly a few words, what is Winemaker.com? So our goal is really to become Europe's leading direct-to-consumer marketplace for wine. Direct-to-consumer, it implies what we're doing is shipping wine directly from winemakers across Europe to end customers across Europe. We're doing that by really telling cool stories, things that sort of are, let's say, what winemakers are doing every day. So, sometimes a bit the boring things which actually make a difference in the wine at the end. But then really sell and ship that all across Europe, which brings us in contact with all funny things like custom documents, etc., which make e-commerce nowadays quite interesting. So what we're doing is we're marketing those wineries. A few screenshots from the website. So it's a winery in Valais, which obviously creates super beautiful pictures with all the estates they're having. We're also making sure that the wines that they're having, they're presented in a proper way, that we have good pictures of the bottles, etc. We have details, etc. To be able to really have a bigger audience for those great products, and that in 4 languages. So from the very beginning on, we started, and that also will come a bit later, is regularly a challenge. We started from day 1 on to produce everything in 4 languages, the German, French, Italian, plus English. Which, if you write the concept, sounds always like a super cool idea. It's not that great of an idea anymore if you really have to rewrite every email, every terms and conditions document and everything in all 4 languages, but that's a side story to that. So yeah, wine online, I heard that before somehow. What's the difference with Winemaker? What are we doing different than some of the others? I think the first of all that we are really investing heavily into creating content. So what you've just seen before in the screenshot is what our photographers done, what our story writers have written. We've created interviews to really make sure that customers or potential customers have an easy way of actually figuring out what is that winemaker about, what makes him special. We have quite a large selection, so we have at the moment around 180 wineries on our website, which in total make almost up for 2,000 wines, and we'll intend to raise that to around 4,000 by the end of this year, and then obviously going further and further. The third point is all about shipping. At the moment, we started last year with our sort of beta or MVP, whatever you want to call it, where we only had Swiss wineries on the website. We're starting now this summer with all the wineries from France, Italy, and Austria. And with that, we get into the whole cross-border stuff, sending, shipping, customs, excise tax, and all those funny topics. The fourth point, We'll announce that in about 6 to 8 weeks. We're still working on that. So to the tech part of today. So what are we talking about? I'll talk first quickly about the architecture, so from a high-level perspective, what are we doing, but then pretty quickly deep dive into 2.5 topics. First of all, the front-end part. Second of all, then the e-commerce side. And third of all, then the service integration. So all those topics that I talked about before, they require quite a few external systems to be involved. So how are we doing that? And to the very end, that might be interesting. I collected a bit the numbers. What are we actually paying for that? So what does that cost to run and operate the system at the moment? Just to give a bit a sum for that. Architecture. So our goals before we started back in May 2020. So actually now it's pretty much 1 year now. It's 1 year, 3 days that we started with Winemaker.com. And the goals that we've had from the beginning on were we really wanted to have it's probably a bit too easy to say, but I didn't want to have any operating system where I would have to log on. First of all, it's always imposes security risks, and I guess we're going to hear about that later today. But it's also about then updating systems, really making sure that everything is up to date. And the idea was to really go as much cloud native as possible, so rather use functions, use services, instead of deploying our own applications. The second is, it's not our goal to be the next small wine shop, so scalability was really one topic we were focusing on from the very beginning. Really making sure that everything we're building, we would be able to scale that if required without a big effort across the world. Third of all, high flexibility. I think that is a core criteria probably to almost anything that is being built in that direction, but especially for us, and I guess our developers, they see that like on a daily basis. So we're changing our priorities, and we're changing ideas almost on a daily basis. So to be able to really work in a super flexible way and change priorities, change tasks was always super important. So we have around 3-4 more or less important building blocks. So for the front end itself, so the website, we're using Sanity, which is a headless CMS that runs, is basically built with Nuxt.js and Vercel. So I'll talk about that in a second. And in the back, we have a fully custom-built e-commerce backend system, which is entirely built on AWS. We'll talk then about sort of what I call the service integration piece. So we're using Zapier to integrate many other systems in the back. And Algolia also has become one of our key technology pieces, which we leverage for search, but also product catalog, etc., on the entire website. So let's get started with the front end side. What did we want? And we obviously, as we started 1 year back, with both the front end side but also the back end side, we started with a real intensive, let's say 3-4 weeks, where we had a look at all the products out there to make sure that we, at least based on what was the status back 1 year, what was the best choice for that. Especially that market is evolving super fast, so not necessarily all assumptions we've made back then are still valid, but overall, I think what the decision that we took, we're still quite happy with that. So one of the key focus things was always performance. So from the day one on, like about how do we build that architecture, it was always about performance in mind. It was also about the time where that whole Jamstack concept, and for those who are longer in the industry, it's essentially sort of pre-generating websites, a bit like back in the 90s, but in that case, just with two things in focus. It's first of all performance, and second of all security. If you just have a generated HTML page, there's not that much you actually can do with that to break it. So you really like Jamstack, but I'll talk on that just in the next slide then. The second, 100% headless with a real content abstraction. Why? First of all, to really be able to, like, that plays a bit into the flexibility part, to build different views, to build different things with the content, but sort of the 100% or the content abstraction piece, really to be able to use the content later on in a mobile app. So it's not just about creating some content with HTML and which is a bit stripped down and then you style it, but really having the content stored down to the last piece without any HTML style information. Third, and that proved, especially in that space of a headless CMS, proved to be a bit difficult, multi-language. Many of those concepts are, again, sort of, or the systems are rather new. Many of them have their roots in the US, which apparently still do websites only in English, so Spanish is probably only in California or so a real requirement, but really having the ability to have translation workflows. I said before, 4 languages, so every single page we're having, every article, every product recommendation we're having needs to be translated into 4 languages. To do that without workflows, without processes is entirely impossible, but also the system itself, so that you really can keep up on where are we with translations, which articles or which documents are translated and which not. That is a key requirement, which indeed was probably one of those things, especially in the space of headless CMS, which kicked out most of our evaluation. And the first, just a powerful image management, especially in that times where we have now super big screens. Now, friends always laugh at me because I'm still always working on my small laptop screen. But then obviously mobile devices and everything, and really be able to have a proper image quality without sort of cropping an image for each and every device itself. So Sanity was for us really the choice. First of all, because it's really lightning fast with a great content API. I'll talk about that in a second. What they call the grok, and like the way how you can both update but also get content is super fast, and it's actually really fun to do because you can achieve things super quickly. The content is so structured that, for example, if you have a let's say you mark a text bold in a rich text, it actually creates a substructure for that. So it means if we take content out to translate that, we are actually able to get every single raw content snippet, put that into the translation tool, and then translate that back and make sure we have exactly the same formatting as we've had in the original language. Last but not least, we have quite a few people who actually work with the content, so we needed to have a good authoring interface. Another one which is reasonably simple to scale, but also then to edit and to adapt a bit to our needs. So how does the front end work? If a request in that case now for the first website is going, we're using Cloudflare as CDN for the caching layer, DNS, all those things. And Cloudflare then at first does a request to the website, which is based on, essentially is running on Vercel. We are obviously GitHub is where the code is. We are deploying all the code on Vercel. We pre-generate during deployment time the home pages, so that's a bit like the Jamstack part of it. So homepage plus a few other high traffic pages are pre-generated on deployment time to make sure that we can deliver them immediately without executing any code. Other pages, and that's we'll come to in a second, so it's a server-side rendering for the first request. So if my browser is empty, prior browsing window, I'll do a request. The request hits Vercel. If it's not a generated page, Vercel is generating using Nuxt the page and returning the HTML. It obviously also hosts static assets, the whole JavaScript stuff, etc., etc. But then for the content, also to generate that page, it does a request to Sanity using the grok language, getting content and creating or assembling code with the content and returning that. Now, as at the beginning, one of the key criteria was really performance. We wanted to have it as fast as possible. So what is the fastest once you have a website in your browser? The fastest is actually just to get the raw content and render it in the browser itself. So if you go to the website, the second click, and feel free to figure that out also using the network tab or so in Chrome. It doesn't do a request via Cloudflare anymore, but it does only a raw request directly to Sanity, where it gets the raw JSON data of the page that is being requested. And essentially the same JavaScript that used to run in Vercel for the first request is running in the browser to generate the page directly within the device. It uses the same mechanism also for images, etc. That's going directly, so that there's nothing in between. There's obviously a few more things. I'll talk about the e-commerce part afterwards, so the whole shopping cart, order, and customer management side. That's an additional API we're using, where we get product images, which are stored on S3, which is essentially also via Cloudflare, but that belongs more than to the e-commerce side. We're searching for, or we're both pushing content. Obviously, the whole content itself is being pushed into Algolia, but also the queries, and both for the normal search, where you would the wine search, but also, for example, if you have a website for a winery and it displays the wines of that winery, that's technically all a search that is executed in the back. So it's essentially everywhere the same mechanisms that are working with that, and Algolia is really a bit our product catalog in the meantime. I talked before about translation. That's really a bit a key thing as we started. in the very beginning, we had nothing live yet, and then we had the first wineries where we created the content. That was then typically they created that in Word, and then we used the Word and put that into DeepL, and then we gave that to translators to actually create the proper content out of that. That worked sort of on a project basis for the very initial content pieces, but now as we really have like a production machine running where people are creating content all over, essentially using Zapier with a bit of functionality there, which gets the content out of Sanity. If something is being marked as requires translation, pushes that into Localize, where then the whole translators are working, and as I mentioned before with the content abstraction, is really able to get or to decouple one article into many translation items, which then also sort of use DeepL, Microsoft Translate, and Google Translate sort of to support translation, but it's still a human translation to make sure we have a proper quality for that. So Jamstack, Quo-Vadis, I said in the beginning, we like Jamstack. The concept itself is technically a great idea, but as with many of the content management systems, the whole Jamstack concept seems to ignore a bit. There's actually multiple countries, multiple languages, which really create an issue if you have large sites. So if you have your small POC site, to render that via Jamstack like that doesn't actually, no one really cares. In our case, if you would now look a bit forward and we would have 2,000 wineries on the website with, I don't know, 15,000 stories, 30,000 product pages, etc., 4 languages in 7 countries, that would result in 413,000 pages, which technically, as there at the moment, there's no real way for incremental builds. We would have to generate 413,000 pages for each and every content update we're doing, and that is not exactly the idea how it makes sense. There's certainly workarounds, like you generate a new website only every hour or so, which creates other issues, but still, if you would create every hour 413,000 pages, the bill that we would have to pay would be slightly different in comparison to what we're paying right now. We'll talk about that at the end. So what we're doing now is sort of to get a bit into those concepts, really generate those high traffic pages, but then to still have the requirement on super fast performance, we'll fetch that raw content and render that on the client. So lessons learned. So what did we now in a bit more than or almost a year now learn in the front end space for that? First of all and foremost, and then I've been working quite a bit with that, sort of more with the sort of integrating into and getting stuff out from Sanity. The content API they're having is just extremely cool. It's extremely cool and extremely fast. Sort of the flexible way how you can update content, but also just get also lots of content in literally no time. That's actually really cool, and everyone who didn't have a look at any of those systems, I really recommend having a look at that and playing a bit around with that. That really is fun for that. Second, there is rapid development in that whole space of headless CMS. So if you look at also Sanity 1 year back and now, there's a huge development. It's also, it's I would say very continuous development. It does break every now and then. Something doesn't work in the morning. At least it's fixed in 2 hours later. So the reaction times are quite good for that. But as we're living pretty much on the edge with deployments of like, I don't know, 15 times, 20 times a day or something in that direction, we're also updating the CMS part super regularly. And that is, on one side, it brings new features all the time. On the other side, it also breaks stuff every now and then. Third, multi-language. It works in comparison to most of the other headless CMS systems. But it is still very basic. And I mean, I'm working in the CMS industry essentially half my life. And sort of one of the key selling criteria for many of the CMSs was really, we have like what you see is what you get, in-place editing, ability to change a website and see exactly how it looks like. from that perspective, headless CMSs are actually almost a way back into the 90s or so, before we had in-place editing and all those great features where you could see how the website looks. But it just doesn't matter anymore because you have so many output devices, you have so many different screen sizes, etc., and it is just not relevant about how does something look like in the editing phase, and that is really what for us sort of, if you overcome that inner struggle that it technically you should see how it looks like exactly, then that works extremely well. Still, multi-language, it works for us quite well, but it is quite basic at the end. We used initially GraphQL, so it has two query languages. One is Grok, they're more internal, I think, and then the second is GraphQL. Initially, we thought, let's use all those new cool hip features. So we used also for Sanity GraphQL initially, but switched then pretty quickly to Grok. It didn't really help us in any kind, and especially sort of the query syntax and the flexibility to do queries was just way bigger with the internal Grok language than by using GraphQL. So let's switch gears and let's go to the backend. So that evaluation phase took even a bit longer, and I still remember it vividly because that's essentially what I've done for, I would say, like 6 weeks or so, where probably like 70% of my time really went into talking to e-commerce vendors, figuring out how the systems work, really try that out, set up pilots, and I would say or at least now almost a year back, I had a really good overview about what kind of e-commerce systems the market has. And essentially, we just had 2 requirements on a high-level perspective. The first was from a functionality perspective. Our setup is not the standard e-commerce setup. So if we receive an order, we technically have to split, or it might be we have to split it up in up to, I don't know, 10 or 15 different orders which go to different wineries, create in that case different fulfillments, and in the speech of e-commerce systems, that is typically an inventory or a warehouse, which means that we pretty quickly would have needed around 2,000 inventory locations. And if you typically ask them that, like how do you handle like the number of inventory locations, what's like the maximum, they went a bit silent, because typically the price calculation and everything is based on that. So that really was a bit the killer, where I would say 80% of the, probably even 90% of the e-commerce systems were not able to cope with that without having really ugly hacks to sort of make that happen. The second was cloud native. So we really, as I said at the beginning, I don't want to have a system where I need to log on in a terminal. And we really didn't want to care about sort of managing the infrastructure. We obviously do, but sort of infrastructure as code, and again, rather consume services, deploy functions, etc. But we didn't want to care about, do we have to spin up an application server? How do we manage that, etc. That really wasn't our goal. With those 2, I would say rather simple requirements, it actually resulted in only, let's say, 1.5, 2 e-commerce systems which technically still would be able to cope with that, but even those would have been extremely expensive in the long run. So to give you a bit an idea, I would say it's roughly like $1 per order or something in that direction, which doesn't really matter if you have 50,000 orders. But if you have 1 million orders, then you just pay a license fee, $1 million for the e-commerce product. That sort of just in my mind didn't exactly scale. At the same time, as we are working with the wineries, we also have to manage their products and their wines. We needed to have a super simple interface. So it was for us, okay, essentially what we could use was sort of the shopping cart API and sort of the basic structure. But behind that, we anyway have to build everything ourselves. We want to build the front end in an entirely custom way. And on the other side, we also needed the back end to be super simple to make sure that we actually that we can work with those with the wineries who are not necessarily super tech savvy. So at the very end, for us, there wasn't enough value in paying such a high amount for an e-commerce system, and we decided to build it our own. That's sort of the Winemaker Studio, how we call that, which is our e-commerce solution. It essentially takes care of products, products with a bit more complicated in the area of wine. So we have products with different vintages. We have products with different variants, which are typically different sizes. We have products with which have caps. We have products which have corks, etc. So many different variants. We have sets, etc. So the whole shebang of what you sort of need with products, you can be sure to have that with wine. Then, obviously, most important, we somehow need to make money, so we need to manage orders. So orders and then fulfillment, so shipping the orders to the winemakers and making sure they're being shipped to the end customers. So all that management is essentially based on a DynamoDB, where we store all the content, lambdas on top, which are being deployed, cognitive user management, and we'll talk about that in a second. It's 100% API based, so there's nothing which is not going through the API. Both towards the front end, obviously, there anyway, but also towards the Winemaker Studio. Essentially, it leverages the same, just a bit more, but essentially exactly the same API as we are using on the website. Obviously, just with update capabilities, but I think that's one of the plus points. Also, we're working there with GraphQL to really sort of define on a granular basis who is able to perform which task with granular permissions. That is working quite well. So we're exposing the product catalog, mentioned that before, via Algolia, so vintages, variations, and then it always sounds super simple in the beginning, but just if you have variations, what is now a default variation? You have pre-orders and all that stuff, so that is quite complicated. Plus shopping cart API, and initially it was, I said at the research, there's many products out there which are just doing a shopping cart, and I was always like, what's a shopping cart? I can build a shopping cart in half a day, so it really can't be that complicated. That I would say is one of the good learnings about that. A shopping cart is quite complicated, and there's many things that you actually build into that. We've learned it the hard way. We're happy now with that, but that was really quite an investment from a development perspective we've done there. But then what we really wanted to do, and myself, I'm sort of an old Unix guy, and that concept of having many small systems working together, that it was really something we wanted to apply. We didn't want to build the next monolith with that. So the Winemaker Studio, our solution, is really, it takes only the core of that. So it manages orders, it manages the status of those, but it doesn't do anything else. Everything else that is outside is essentially managed by third parties, and we invoke that using webhooks. So we have a system where we can, for pretty much every event, new order updated, status changed, order paid, etc. There's essentially a webhook system where we connect ourselves in, also to keep that a bit separated, and really making sure that we don't overload a single system. We have another screenshot here, the management interface that is built on Vuetify. So that now didn't get the biggest love. It was essentially about it needs to work, and that's what it does, and is certainly not a marketing website. So how does that look like? All the yellow boxes, that's all AWS functions. So it's CloudFront at the very beginning, and then it's essentially AppSync, what we're using primarily as GraphQL API layer. AppSync then either communicates directly with the DynamoDB, and that is primarily the case also for the Winemaker Studio if we update the product, etc. Or, and I'm actually not even sure if that's a proper name, but we're using it that way sort of a bit to digest what kind of lambdas they are. It's a function lambda, so which is also invoked via AppSync with the GraphQL API, but then does some functionality in the backend. Again, stores everything in the DynamoDB, and changes in DynamoDB then again have triggers, and many things that happen on that then essentially are triggered by, we call that a trigger lambda again, essentially a lambda which primarily does two things. It first of all pushes the content into Algolia, so if it's a product that needs to be updated, and second of all, it exposes during a very generic webhook interface where you can subscribe to those. It exposes all those events, which we're then subscribing to from via Zapier. I'll talk about that in a second. It's a bit more obviously, so it's slightly simplified. There's two interfaces that we have directly within the system. It's into the payment gateway and the credit check. That was just for performance. Essentially, if you want to pay by invoice, before we allow you to pay by invoice, we do a credit check, which means we have the time from someone enters his address, clicks on save, which in the next step is the payment instrument selection. So essentially that's the time we have to actually figure out, do we want to allow that customer to pay by invoice or only prepayment and credit card? So that is really super time critical. So we're performing that request directly and also synchronously. Plus then the payment gateway, if payments are initiated, if they're getting back, that's what we decided to keep into the system, as that is just from a security perspective then too critical and doesn't really add additional value if that's outside. Also then the next thing, what obviously happens as well is then the sort of the updates for that, they don't happen only from a user perspective, from the front end or from the back end, but also then via events, and that is then pretty much in the next section, and that at the end goes through exactly the same API. So it's sort of one API which we use in both for sort of transactions that happen in the back, for our backend system, but also for the front end. S3, I said it before, we store the images there, and that is more or less the full picture. There's obviously always 1,000 small pieces on the right and left, but I think it gives a pretty good sort of overview about what is being used for the entire e-commerce platform. So what we learned, many things the hard way. So I would still say this as a summary. It is harder to write an e-commerce system from scratch than I initially thought or hoped for, but it really pays off with ultimate flexibility, especially as we are not having like a standard e-commerce setup, and now we're working with exports, which essentially means we're pooling many orders into one single export, where we need to know exactly how many bottles do we have, of what size, how much alcohol, and need to calculate that in 150 ways. That would be a real pain to add that to many existing e-commerce systems. So to just have that flexibility to just add that is actually super cool. So I would say it was a hard ride, but in the meantime we're really benefiting from that, that we actually were able to build it in a way how it really makes sense for our use case. Second, and I think that let's call it microservice architecture, to use like a next buzzword, to build that with the Lambdas and the Node.js stuff and those AWS libraries, that works pretty well. There's always, if you've written it, you would do it totally different afterwards. You would use a few different things, but overall with that approach and how we've built that, we're actually extremely happy. And even if we would start again from scratch, we probably would generally do that the same way. We're using Amplify, and it was initially a lot about to accelerate the development, and that in the beginning it really speeds it up, and especially in combination together with GraphQL, that helps a lot. But over time, it really is. It rather slows you down. It rather slows down. There's too many open GitHub issues, and at the moment we have a bit sort of a combination of Amplify and Terraform. And that is a bit on our to-do list whenever we wouldn't have that many things on our bucket list to do, to replace that fully from Amplify to Terraform. GraphQL, I mentioned that a few times, so super easy integration with Amplify. Its strict schema has its advantages, but also many disadvantages. Especially from a deployment perspective, and we're rather trying a bit to remove it from the front end. It works in quite well in Studio, but really if you have in the front end playing it together with other systems, I think it's worth a thought whether that really accelerates it or not. But certainly in the back end, sort of type security, etc., that helps a lot. Last but not least, we initially started with Elasticsearch. We thought, okay, let's make sense somehow, use that all within the AWS stack. We spent quite some time and money to get that somehow running. Until then, we actually decided, okay, let's get rid of it and let's move to Algolia, where we probably, I don't know, like 10% of the time built way more. So in that case, it was less a build-yourself approach, but rather, again, use the service. And I think that was our learning there. In many cases, actually pays off to use a bit more expensive service, which really is properly made towards that, and that has the real cool APIs for that. The last piece, what else do we need to do except sort of we have the customer submitted the order, and it's in the system now, and just alone for an order, sort of what needs to be done, and that at the end is all works via the webhooks. So we first need to send an order confirmation via email. And again, for that, to have a proper user experience, it's not about just writing some two-liner. You actually need to send a properly formatted email which has like a proper summary of your shopping cart with nice pictures in that, nicely formatted, obviously all in 4 languages, etc., etc. So that's a bit more effort than you initially would think of. Second, then initiate the shipping with the delivery provider. Then send the order to the wineries. Really make sure that they read that. Send them the shipping label, delivery notes, so all those documents that they need for it. If it's an export, create export documents. Manage the shipping notifications. So if a package has been picked up, make sure we move the order into the next stage. If the package has been delivered, and what also happens from time to time, if a package sort of has been lost or there's just no updates, and we actually see that in the system and can proactively work on that. Invoice is also a bit a bigger topic. Like, we make sure that we generate a proper PDF invoice, that especially for business customers who need to add it to expenses or so, to be able to archive that properly. The whole bookkeeping, if we have payment by bank transfer, make sure that we match that. Make sure that once it's paid, we mark it as paid. Prepayment, we obviously have to ship the stuff only once it's paid, etc., etc. Reminders. So, and that's only what we do for an order. There's more things than we're paying obviously the wineries once a month. Sort of once a month we need to have like a sort of monthly statement which automatically initiates the money transfer to them. We're sending them once a week their inventory status. If you can on a product you can subscribe to updates. We're syncing a lot of content between the studio and Sanity. For example, if you want to select a product, that's sort of a bit put into the back of Sanity, and vice versa, to make sure that they're in sync for many things. Watchdogs to make sure the process is working fine, and then also sort of the product catalogs for Google Shopping, for example. Those are all things that we're doing outside of the core system, but really use the data of the core system for that. So what else is there being used? I mentioned before, Zapier is sort of in the middle of that. I'll talk about that in a second. Then it's like Sendiblu is a transactional email tool. PDF for me is actually a great Swiss company who's compressing PDFs in by far the best way I've ever seen. PDF generator API is like a template-based application which generates nicely looking proper invoices and shipping documents, etc. And shipping providers, credit checks, bookkeeping. So all those things which sort of are needed primarily for an order, but there's obviously way more things. Internally we use, for example, Jira to manage the wineries. We use DocuSign to sign contracts with them, which all is automated in the back. So there's about 15 more systems which are integrated into that. AWS, the S3 for data storage, etc., etc. So for that, I said now about 5 times Zapier. For those who haven't heard about that, it's sort of one of those, and there's like Automate.io, there's Integromat, there's a few of those. I guess they call sort of low code or no code automation platforms. And I actually don't even remember what the exact reason was why we've chosen Zapier back then, but it is really easy to start and to expand. It's actually relatively easy to build your custom apps and your custom code steps. And what is really working super nicely is sort of the job and issue management. So in that case, actually should have added one which failed. on the screenshot, but as you can see on the picture here, that's sort of now the first event, which was from our own application from the studio, which is a fulfillment ready for shipment. That's the moment when we send that to the winemaker. So that it's registered with the shipping provider and it's ready for shipment. We also put them into Google Drive. At the same time, by chance, there was a daily SMS reminder for those who pick up, and there's also one of the watchdogs which then would put a warning into Slack in case that something hasn't been picked up. In that case, everything works fine. If there's an error, there's proper error notifications, and it's super cool. There was a replay functionality for that. There's then ways sort of to parameterize that. Just sort of one screenshot on the left, which is a bit an easier one. On the right is a bit a custom one for the bookkeeping system, where there's obviously a bit more data than coming into it. But the cool thing is really super easy to change that and adapt also sort of with different paths to make sure that it's not all in one core system. Yeah, I talk quickly about sort of our own Winemaker Studio app, which has quite a set of triggers and actions. So everything that we're somehow doing works through that. And for that, then that's sort of the second last slide for it. What we've learned is they're a really cool accelerator. They really supported that we use that kind of micro-architecture, not putting everything into one system. I really love the task management with error handling feature for it. The custom code is still one of the key things that we're actually using and need for that. The use of those pre-built apps is helpful to some extent for easy use cases. For a bit more complicated use cases, it's typically then a bit too simple and doesn't expose the entire API. And last but not least, and that's obviously a bit where they come from originally, it's not that much of an enterprise system. So the whole lifecycle management, yeah, that is still a bit the problem, and we still haven't fully figured out what's the best way for that. A last slide, I think, just because that's sort of interesting. So we have quite a slew of tools, but from a pricing perspective, in comparison to actually buying any of the e-commerce systems, and it's obviously not a fully complete list, but it's almost. So you're paying at the moment a bit more than $1,000 for all those systems. That obviously will scale a bit with more traffic, etc. But sort of on the way how that's built, with really pre-generating stuff, with really making sure that you look a bit how you build it performance-wise. You're actually able, with some tech know-how, to build those things in a super cheap way. At least I would say that $1,100 is nothing for that. And for us, I would say still exactly the right choice. We're super happy with that. And at the same time, we also learned a lot. Thanks a lot for the time. Are there any questions, Thomas?
There were no questions so far, so maybe it was of the very fast speaking, so it was very exciting, and I would say super packed information in a most short, how to say that, the shortest possible amount of time. It's very good. So thank you very much. So regarding the time, I would say we move strictly over to Florian. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.